So as our next conversation begins, I wanted just to give you a quick background on this study. Back about a year ago, we noticed a swing of Hispanic voters. I understand, it's a dialogue, we all like to communicate. I will keep it brief. But we wanted to study the Hispanic vote because we saw a swing happening in California during that recall election where that Hispanic vote had shifted away from the Democrats and then came back to them. And I said, well, that was interesting. And so we were talking with members of the Emerson team, and one of our trustees, Robert Miller, who's unable to be with us today as he's searching for a new president for Emerson, sponsored this research and gave us a really strong donation to be able to conduct 18 focus groups in 6 states, 7 surveys, 1 national, and all about Hispanic voters to better understand these trends of this growing population. And as we look at these elections, the 2 states to keep an eye on is Arizona and Nevada. And if those states swing, then that's where the Hispanic vote swings. And if they don't, then the Democrats still have that Hispanic vote. So with that said, let's talk some insights with Isabel and Laura. Thank you.
We're just delighted to be able to share our initial findings of this research, as Spencer mentioned, in 6 states. And we've been doing this for the last 8 months. And we collected data really over 4 key areas. That is, what are the most important issues? What is their media consumption? What are the civic attitudes? And how do they feel about politics and partisanship?
So before we talk about the political parties and voting, what we found is we needed to first establish what kind of issues are most important to the Hispanic community. The way that we structured this in the survey was to open up the survey with an initial open-ended question. Hey, what's the most pressing problem facing your community? We didn't want to give it as a closed-ended question with 8, 9, or 10 options because we didn't want to kind of pigeonhole that community into what we already perceive as top issues. And what we found, which interesting mirrors a lot of what we saw in our pre-election polls that Spencer was talking about, is that the economy has continued to really dominate as the most important issue for this community. In every survey, at least 30% of respondents were referencing economic issues and really inflation as the issue that was most pressing in the Hispanic community.
And from what we learned from the focus groups is when they were talking about the economy, they were talking about GDP or anything like that. It was really about, as we phrased it, the economy, how it affected them, right? What was the cost of living, prices, so everything was framed around costs and them being able to make ends meet, specifically like wages. Immigration was also discussed in the groups largely because they had a direct relationship with someone who was dealing with immigration or an immigration issue and trying to get their citizenship.
It's interesting because, as Laura mentioned, we studied states all around the country. And what we found is that there's a different perception of this issue of immigration in a border state like Texas compared to a landlocked state like Colorado. In Texas, the immigration issue was framed more so as dealing with individuals, family, and friends who are looking to come to America and cross the border and the difficulties in going through that initial process. In comparison, in Colorado, a lot of the focus group respondents talked to us about how they have family and friends who are already in the United States and how they are playing into the job market and how immigration plays into jobs in the economy.
And to understand where Hispanics are formulating their opinions on immigration and the economy, we looked into that second area of media consumption. Where are they getting their news?
And the survey really provided us with some important baseline information on what mediums are being used to get and access political information. And it might not be a surprise, print news is kind of dead in the Hispanic community. We found that respondents were much more likely to indicate that they're getting their political information from social media and from television news than they were from print media.
Everybody has a cell phone, right? Let's see your cell phones. Let's see them. Yeah, okay. Focus groups told us this is where people are getting their news, right? This is the new access to news. And it's taking the place of broadcast and print. And I'm looking forward to the conversation when we get done with the presentation, talk a little bit more about that, because that's some really interesting things happening. But there was also some great conversations in the focus group about social media and the use of YouTube and Twitter and TikTok.
And there there are even apps that aren't considered social media that are acting really as aggregators of news. If you have an Apple phone, it's likely Apple News. If you have an Android, it's likely Google News. So when Laura would ask focus group respondents to tell us where they're getting their information, a lot of times they would just hold up their phone and they would say, I get a notification and it gives me the news. So they're not looking for one specific source, but rather these aggregators like Apple News and Google News that kind of provide all of the sources in one accessible place for them.
One exciting thing about this study that I loved was that we spoke to non-registered Hispanics. So these are Hispanics who are citizens but haven't registered. So we're trying to unlock, why aren't they participating? What is it? And so when we spoke to them about where they're learning about the world, guess what? It's their lived experience. How do they know the economy is bad? Well, because every time I go fill up my gas tank, it's costing me $100. So they're really reliant on their lived experience to inform them about what's going on in the world.
And that brings us finally to civic engagement in voting. And since, as Laura mentioned, we studied both voters and non-registered citizens, we had to approach these questions in different ways because one group are actively participating in the political process and the other group is kind of distancing themselves by choice, not registering to vote. So what we did in the survey was we asked these non-registered citizens questions about what could persuade them to register to vote, to really unlock this Hispanic vote and increase the turnout and increase the amount of Hispanics that are registered. Unfortunately, we found about half of Hispanics in each of these states indicated nothing. There is nothing that you could do or say that would persuade me to register to vote. But I mean, we like to look at it as a glass half full there, you know, so half of them are still persuadable and could be persuaded to really enter the political processes. The most common answers that those individuals gave included different or better candidates and just generally having more information on the elections.
Yeah, so in the focus group, we framed this question around citizenship, like what does it mean to be a good citizen? What does that mean? And surprisingly enough, the answers were really about a community and a communal. So helping others, helping your neighbor, not littering. That was an interesting thing. They talked about not littering and how important that was, not committing crimes. Surprisingly, voting, not so much, not really a part of their understanding of what civic participation is.
It's interesting too because among the registered voters in the survey, we did ask them what persuades them to actually get out and vote since we know that they're registered. And among older Hispanics and among first generation Hispanics in particular, we noted that they were saying that a duty as a citizen to vote was persuading them to get out on election day much more so than their partisan inclinations or even voting on a specific issue.
And lastly, we talked to respondents about the perceptions of political parties and how did the parties align on certain key issues.
So the way that we framed that in the survey is we did a 6-question battery where we asked which party do you align with on this issue. Some of the issues that we decided to focus on included immigration, abortion, and the economy. What I found most interesting in this battery of questions was the issue of abortion. It's worth noting that we conducted this study pre and post Roe, but we kind of saw a straight trend on that question of which party do you align with on abortion, and it really went against that conventional political thought that because the Hispanic community tends to have a higher proportion of Catholics, they would then lean towards the Republican Party on the issue of abortion. We found that this was not supported by our data at all. In fact, Hispanics leaned towards the Democratic Party on abortion even more so than they did on issues such as immigration and in some states, the economy.
So we really wanted to dig in deep as to how the parties and the party brands were being interpreted by Hispanics. So what we found is that, generally speaking, the Republican Party was considered to be the party of the wealthy, the white, and primarily stood up for corporations. While the Democratic Party was seen as being for the working class, people of color, but surprisingly also for corporations. But what we found too is that on the issue of immigration, they feel that both parties are letting them down, that both parties are making promises that they're not fulfilling.
And what's interesting, just to jump in there for a second, so we saw that they were leaning more towards the Democratic Party in the survey on all of these issues, but in the focus groups, we were kind of hearing some differences there, and particularly when they would talk about the Democratic Party, they would talk about the Democratic Party as not very effective. So what we decided to do was, because inflation was so commonly talked about in both the focus groups and the survey, is add a last question on that issue battery of which party do you trust to handle inflation? Because respondents were saying that they align with the Democratic Party on the economy, and when we added that question, they were trusting Republicans on inflation. Even though they align with the general ideology of the Democratic Party, what they've seen in the past couple of years with Joe Biden, I think, has led a lot of them to say, hey, I trust the Republican Party better, even if I align with the Democratic Party on ideology.
So what this research has showed us is that we still have a lot to learn about what it takes to unlock the Hispanic vote. This data, both combination of focus groups and survey data, which is very unique and is rarely done. So really proud to be making a mark in this area. It's showing that Hispanics' perceptions of parties is still very fluid, and we have a lot to learn. One of the things, and I'll leave this quote as we open it up for questions, is a participant in Colorado, and just said, both parties are taking Hispanics for granted. So I think that's a real interesting insight into the way they feel political parties are affecting their lives.
Well, ladies, thank you so much. Yeah,
Susan.
I'm going to come up and play a little bit of moderator, a little bit of timekeeper. And, you know, I've enjoyed this process so much, being part of Emerson College polling and seeing these results. And I love your presentation, but I'm going to ask you to go a little deeper and kind of go back and forth. Tell me what surprised you the most. I mean, I have my opinions, but you guys are the experts. Like, what were your pullaways? I'll start with you, Isabel, like on the data and kind of maybe even looking at the focus groups and things that maybe you didn't put in your report, but like we want the inside look. So tell us about that.
So when we were first talking about conducting this research project, when we started talking about those non-registered voters, I was so excited because in all of my work at Emerson College polling, you know, obviously we focus on the registered voters because we're asking about these elections. And the non-registered population is really not surveyed, especially about political issues, to the same degree. So it was interesting to do the surveys of those groups, but then when we would see those individuals talk in the focus groups, a lot of them were very well informed about politics, followed the political processes, followed all of the candidates very closely, even though they're choosing to not participate in the political process. So that was really surprising to me, but their explanations all made sense, that the more they watch, the less they want to participate in some ways, because they just aren't satisfied, they aren't trusting, and they're not seeing follow through.
And one of the things I don't think we actually shared is that one of the focus groups we actually conducted in Spanish, so got to speak in the language preferred by Latinos. And I kind of expected there to be really stark differences between the English language and the Spanish language, and there really wasn't. There were some subtle differences, but I wouldn't say there were stark differences in terms of their understanding of politics and their attitudes.
Okay, and this was not about a horse race. We were not trying to poll these states to figure out what was going to happen this election cycle 2022. So we really got into the issues, the concerns. And so these ladies have a tremendous amount of knowledge on what kind of is getting people to kind of clue in and what's turning them off. So I kind of want to open it up to questions because this is a dialogue and we have a wealth of information here. So I'd like to start taking questions if I can. Yes, back there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Raul Candelaria. I'm a PhD student at Howard University, Department of Communication, Culture, and Media Studies. I'm from New Mexico. I appreciate the work you're doing. I think it is extremely telling what you found out. I guess when I think about it and what you presented, a couple of things come to mind related to questions here is, given that the Latino or Latinx population is not monolithic, and it is very diverse, did your poll look at that? It's one question. The second one is that another interesting piece that you brought out, the issue of technology, and how technology by this particular ethnic group is used in relationship, not just to the phone, but if we dig deep into the issue of age cohorts, did you look at age cohorts or gender differences when particularly looking at social media, simply because when we look at like TikTok users, most TikTok users are from Gen Z or the earlier millennials. So I'm interested on the social media side, the technology side, of the age cohort, the gender issue, and usage of where they got their information on Qualitative.
Great questions.
Thank you very much.
Great questions, thank you so much. For the survey, we did ask country of origin, so we have a lot of crosstabs so we can see the differences between this very diverse population. I would say Florida is probably the state that we could kind of see those differences more because of the large Cuban population in comparison to some of the other countries of origins. And thank you so much for that social media question, because I meant to actually say this. 70% at least of respondents in every single state indicated that they use social media to some degree to get their political information. And among non-registered citizens, that number is even higher, and as you suggest, among those under 50, it's almost 100%, honestly. I didn't notice any stark differences on gender there. And we also asked a question of which social media platform individuals were using most to access this political information. And as you suggested, TikTok was really popular with the under 30 crowd, and YouTube was really popular with the middle-aged crowd. And there were a couple of states, I think Florida in particular, was a state where YouTube was used to a very high degree.
Yeah, and I'm going to use the F word, Facebook. Big time, right? They're using Facebook. In fact, several groups called Facebook Gossip Book, because that's where they would get all the chisme, right? That's where they'd get all the information about what's going on and not going on. But when we asked, like, so are you engaging in political content on Facebook? They're not clicking and liking and doing, it's just being fed to them, right? It's being fed to them. And a lot of times the conversation was, well, I don't like to engage in conversation because then I end up getting in a fight with someone. And they don't want to get in a fight. So really the stuff that they're consuming is being fed to them by family members or other people that are sharing it, or frankly, Facebook ads, right? The ads that are coming in. And I just want to point this out because when we talk about print media being less consumed, that's the actual paper, right? They're still consuming New York Times and Wall Street Journal, but it's on Facebook. And what they're consuming is the headline. Because when they go to click it, it says, guess what? You have to pay to access this article. And they're like, I'm not going to pay. They just Google the article and get it from another source. And what we found is that in the focus groups, they talked about if an article is being, or a subject is being reported by multiple media, then it must be true, right? So if it's being reported on CNN and Fox News and I'm seeing it on YouTube, it must be true. But if it's only being reported on BBC News and that's the only media that's reporting it, might not be true.
That makes me think about just one thing. This is actually pretty alarming and scary. Some individuals in these groups would also say that if content was removed from the internet, that increased its credibility because it was trying to be silenced. There was an agenda that was trying to take the content off, and that was particularly, they were talking about YouTube content, and particularly a lot of it was about health communication and about COVID. They said that a lot of information that was the truth about COVID that was taken off of the internet was the most credible sources that were out there.
And talking about credibility, Google, extremely credible. I don't think there was a single person that talked about Google being nefarious. Like, Google is a trusted source, right, of news.
For the 50%, and let me just position that we live in Arizona and Pennsylvania. So Arizona, this is particularly important to us. For the 50% who are not registered and could not, and the 50% of those who could not be persuaded to register, do you have a sense of the demographic breakdown there? And then I have a follow-up question on a different topic.
So it tended to be older individuals, which kind of makes sense because they've been disengaged from the political process their entire lives. They haven't been registered, or in some cases in the focus groups, they were registered when they were younger, and then they just kind of stopped participating because they felt like it wasn't really making an impact. So it tended to be older individuals, where the younger individuals were a little bit more malleable.
And I have a theory about what we call the non-voters, right? I see them along 4 dimensions. They're disconnected, dysfunctional, disalienated, or, disillusioned or alienated. So those are sort of like the 4 categories. And in our non-voter groups, I think we had a little bit of each. We had quite a dysfunctional one in Colorado, where he was just completely just an artist, like just not even just getting him to participate in the group. But once we started talking about politics, then he would like start to engage, but very, very disconnected from what's happening in the world around him.
And then the other question is, with regard to this mistrust of both parties and disappointment in both, to what degree do the parties proactively come to you, or the candidates proactively come to you and ask for a deep dive on your data?
We haven't.
Yeah, we haven't spoken to either party or any candidates really, but what was important to us, because this was honestly conceived as academic research,
Yeah.
we have published all of our findings.
So they can get it.
Yeah,
Right.
all of the focus group transcripts are even out there.
Do you think they know that it's out there? They know to look for it?
I don't know.
I mean, we're not
But
hearing
typically
anything from the
campaigns are gonna be
Democratic Party
interested in
about
this.
the economy.
Yeah, I mean,
And yet,
I'm just going to jump in on that. I'm good. Thanks. One of the things was to collect this data. We're still going to be doing a full analysis of the total of the 6 states we went into, and be presenting later next year at APOR, which is kind of the pollsters' convention, if you will. But in between that, we're a place to come for our research. It's not, we can't make anyone look at it in that regard. But I will tell you, I think after the election is over, because campaigns were focused right now on 2022, and that was not the priority of this research project. As a matter of fact, I pretty much can guess that everyone who's running for anything from president to city council member is going to be going to the Emerson College polling website to find this data, because it is about really moving forward. And that's why we did not specifically go into candidates, which I think was something that was so important, so we can understand better where people were able to kind of just tell their story, if they will, without having to talk about it in a political environment of who you're voting for. And that's where I wanted to go back to you,
and
Laura.
also understanding the systemic barriers that are keeping Latinos from voting. So in Georgia, for instance, long lines, things that, problematic. In other states, the Electoral College. My vote doesn't matter because the state's going to go another way. So there are these systemic barriers that are keeping them from participating as well.
And one thing I just love for Isabel to go into, another barrier is the Blue Book, if you could.
Yes, so it was fascinating for us, because in Colorado, one of the focus group participants asked the rest of the participants, "Do you read the book?" And we were like, "What book?" And in Colorado, every single registered voter is mailed a few weeks before the election a comprehensive blue book, dozens of pages, that really goes in depth on not only the candidates that are running for statewide office, local office, but also the local ballot initiatives, the statewide ballot initiatives. And what we found is, actually, when provided with this breadth of information, individuals were turned off by it. Individuals thought that it was too much, too complicated, and they even thought that they were being tricked by the information. They said that the descriptions were too convoluted, and the Blue Book made them want to vote less, which I'm sure was the opposite of
Even
its
though they're
intention.
saying that they need more information to vote. So they're saying they want more information, and when you literally hand it to them in a book, it's too much information.
So my question is, on the data that you collected from across the country, it's kind of 2 questions wrapped in one. Was Massachusetts one of them? And on the topic of immigration in the state, have you seen a difference in Hispanic voter opinion before and after the news of Venezuelan migrants being taken to Martha's Vineyard?
Great question. I believe all of the data was conducted before Martha's Vineyard. And on Massachusetts, we unfortunately did not do that state. We hope to do more states in the future. We didn't get any northeastern states or midwestern states, so that would definitely be what we would be looking to do next.
And we didn't do California.
My question is, so you talked about how on abortion they were pretty much
They were very democratic in their thinking. That was a quantitative piece of data, but also I'm interested, what kind of things were you hearing from the qualitative actual focus group that people were saying on abortion that also supported the data showing they were more towards the democratic views on abortion?
yeah, so there was a lot of conversation around this, because as we mentioned, literally we were doing a focus group when the leak happened, so it was literally a marker in our research. But I think the thing that surprised me around the abortion was a lot of the focus group men talked about how that's a woman's decision. Like, I can't even begin to participate in this conversation because that's a woman's decision.
And that was even conservative men who were
Yeah,
saying that. It wasn't just men who were independent or Democrat, even men who were very conservative on every other issue in the focus group. When it came to abortion, they did not want to say much. They said it was not their issue to speak on.
Yes, in the back over there.
What can you tell us about the story behind the Mayra Flores effect of Hispanics worried about God, family, and the nation, about this conservatism versus what you discovered about abortion? What are the stories that you heard in your data?
Well, I think Mayra Flores is really, because that's Texas, and that's really a move about economics, right? This is really about, and South Texas is a very interesting area because of the oil industry, the border. There's a lot of layers in there, right? And so I think maybe the question is, like, are Latinos a single issue voter, right? Are they voting just on abortion? Are they voting just on this? Are they voting just on immigration? And I think the answer is that they're voting on the economy, which is what we're seeing in Nevada, right? We're seeing that it is, again, the economy. How is the economy affecting them? And when I asked in the focus group, who's responsible for the economy? The answer is always the government. So that's the response.
And also in the focus groups, when Laura would ask about that concept of being a good citizen, that idea of the family unit came up a lot, and how the family unit has kind of fallen off a little bit and it's not as strong. And it's interesting because there were a lot more respondents who, when we asked them at the end we had like these workbooks where we would ask them to write down what they thought about when they thought about the Republican and Democratic parties. And the Republican parties were written down more so as ones that had family values than the Democratic Party.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, and it's moderator's choice. The title of the survey was Unlocking the Hispanic Vote. So I'm going to ask you both a really kind of on-the-spot question. What are, to Pat's questions, like what should people or candidates be doing to tap into that vote? Or what they're not doing, more importantly, maybe?
You got a good one there.
Got to make it work for it.
Well, I think one is not take the Latinos for granted, right? Like this is, and I mean, the data shows overwhelmingly Latinos tend to vote Democrat. That is a given, right? But there is still this little portion that can be moved across the aisle. And eventually, I do feel that it comes down to what kind of candidates are being run. Do they look like me? Do they know me? Will they fight for me? Will they win for me? Are you putting up the kinds of candidates that they can relate to, right? But most importantly, don't take them for granted. Don't assume that making these promises around immigration or making these promises around DACA, which is the deferred action, like continuing to make these promises and not following through, eventually they're gonna like stop believing. And so I think these are real lessons that parties and politicians need to think about, is that when you make these promises and you don't fulfill them, it has consequences in the long run.
I would say pretty similar things, but I would also add that specifically on that issue of immigration, they were talking about immigration and immigration reform as really the last 40 years. They weren't talking about just Obama and Trump, they were talking about Reagan. And I think that issue of immigration, the economy, it affects everybody. So does immigration, but as we talked about in the focus groups, these individuals all had individual personal connections to immigration, whether that be through their own lived experience or the lived experience of their friends and family and community members. So I would say that that is an issue that both parties need to figure out how to connect with the community on and find a better solution.
And Spencer recognized some of the team members, but I just want to take a moment of personal privilege and recognize some of the team, because the work that we do could not happen without the support team. These are hours of transcribing and reviewing and going through the data, and so most of the team is here, and I just want to recognize them. Camila Arconia, Clarissa Carrillo.
Stand up, guys.
It really is a lot of data, so we feel very honored and privileged to be able to present this to you all today as we begin to release our initial findings.
Thank you so much. This is great. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you.